This short presentation is about leukocytes or white blood cells. Leukocytes are the only type of blood cell which are considered complete cells. That's because they contain both nuclei and organelles. As you remember, red blood cells or erythrocytes contain neither. Platelets, in addition, do not contain nuclei or organelles. Leukocytes make up about 1% of the total blood volume, with about 4,000 to 11,000 white blood cells or leukocytes per cubic millimeter of blood. You might remember that 1 cubic millimeter, 1 cubic millimeter of blood is equivalent to 1 microliter of blood. Leukocytes can move from the blood into tissues once they're infected. So when bacteria, viruses, or parasites infect cells, or when tumor cells proliferate, the leukocyte or white blood cell count increases. Generally, when the white blood cell number is greater than 11,000 white blood cells per cubic millimeter of blood, that indicates infection of the body tissues. The purpose of leukocytes or white blood cells is to defend the body against disease. There are two types of leukocytes, granulocytes and agranulocytes. Granulocytes contain cytoplasmic granules. These granules contain enzymes such as peroxidases and hydrolytic enzymes and other chemicals which help fight pathogens. Some of these chemicals stain red with an acidic stain, and some will stain blue with a basic stain. Some stain both, which is often why the granules and the cytoplasm of granulocytes looks purple or violet. Neutrophils, eosinophils, and basophils make up the granulocytes. Agranulocytes, you'll notice, contains the letter A before the word. And remember, when there's an A before a word, it means not, whatever that word means. So agranulocytes have no cytoplasmic granules, and they tend to be lymphocytes and monocytes. Before we talk about individual white blood cells, let's take a look at how prevalent each type of white blood cell is in the blood. On the left bar chart here, you'll see all of the formed elements, and remember the formed elements are the blood cells themselves, and their height is in proportion to how common they are in the blood. Erythrocytes are the most common, followed by platelets, and lastly by leukocytes. Remember, leukocytes only make up 1% of blood. But if we expand the leukocytes to look more closely, we can see that there are many different types of leukocytes. The most prevalent leukocyte is the neutrophil, which makes up about 50 to 70% of all white blood cells. This is followed by lymphocytes, which make up 25 to 45%, then monocytes, eosinophils, and basophils. One phrase that can help you remember which type of white blood cell is the most common, and then the next most common, and the last, is never let monkeys eat bananas. If you look at this phrase and you focus on the first letter of each word, that indicates the type of white blood cell it's referring to. So never refers to neutrophils. Neutrophils are the most populous. Next most populous L is lymphocytes. Next, monkeys stands for monocytes. Eat, and E stands for eosinophils, and last, the least common, B, stands for basophils. So let's start with neutrophils, which are bigger than red blood cells. It's important to compare the white blood cell to the red blood cell because the red blood cell is the most common type you're going to see on the slide. So by comparing the size, it's a clue as to what type of white blood cell you're looking at. In neutrophils, the granules stain lilac and contain granules. The granules consist of things like peroxidases, hydrolytic enzymes, and defensins, which are antibiotic-like proteins. Peroxidases actually are a category of enzymes which inactivate harmful chemicals. The nucleus of neutrophils is multilobed. That means you have one nuclei with many different lobes to it. For this reason, neutrophils are also called polymorphonuclear leukocytes. If we didn't know what this word meant, we could break it down into three parts, in which poly means many, morph means shape, and nuclear refers to the nucleus. So literally this word means white blood cells in which the nucleus has many shapes, many lobes. The function of neutrophils is to destroy bacteria and some fungi. We're going to find that when it comes to white blood cells, each one has a very specific target that it attacks when defending the body. This is a slide of a human blood smear, and you'll see that the most common type of cell, of course, is the red blood cell. Next, you'll see the little purple dots. These are actually platelets. And lastly, all of the other cells are actually neutrophils. Now, there's an unusually high density of neutrophils on this slide. A lot of times you don't see so many of them in one area. But if you look closely, you'll see that the nuclei appears to have many lobes to it. Now, these lobes are all connected, even though sometimes they don't look like they're connected. But they are, usually via a very thin strand of nucleoplasm. The next type of granulocyte is called an eosinophil, and these make up about 1 to 4% of all leukocytes. They have a bilobed nucleus, which I'll show you in a minute, and their cytoplasmic granules really usually stain red. If you have a very good slide and a good microscope, you can also see that the granules are perfectly round. The purpose of eosinophils is to kill parasitic worms. Examples of parasitic worms would be tapeworms or pinworms. And the way that eosinophils work is they release chemicals from the granules onto the surface of the worm, which breaks down the worm. Another role of eosinophils is to lessen the severity of allergic reactions. So often when patients are having a true allergic reaction, the doctor will look at the blood under the microscope to see if there's an increase in the number of eosinophils. Another role of eosinophils is to inactivate inflammatory chemicals. Now, eosinophils can't really break down bacteria, but they can often inactivate inflammatory chemicals, especially ones that are involved in allergic reactions. And that's how they actually decrease the severity of allergic reactions. So if we take a look at eosinophils under the microscope, in this slide here, you can see that the granules here are red. And if you look really close, you can see that they're perfect spheres. The nuclei here is actually colored purple, and if I trace it, it looks kind of like this, kind of bilobed. Often the nuclei will look like, the nucleus looks like an old-fashioned telephone handle. So you might not know what this looks like if you never had an old-fashioned telephone. But it kind of looks like this. If we look to the slide to the right, which is more typical of the view you're going to get from our slides and our microscopes in the lab, you can see that the granules here appear a little bit more pinkish purple, and the nucleus itself really does kind of look like a telephone handle. The next type of granulocyte is a basophil. Basophils only account for about 0.5% of all white blood cells, and so they're kind of hard to find. They're usually the same size as a neutrophil, but they're not often mistaken with as a neutrophil because their granules are very, very dark. They're purple-black. They have a bilobe nucleus, which is either U or S shaped, but it's often hard to see because the granules cover it up. The granules contain two different substances, histamine, which causes inflammation, and it does this by acting as a vasodilator. You'll remember that means it increases the size of the diameter of the blood vessel. Now, if it increases the size of the diameter of the blood vessel, what happens is that the blood flows in, and as it flows in, a lot of the fluid in the blood leaks out into the surrounding tissues, and that's what causes the inflammation. Histamine also attracts other white blood cells. The other chemical found in the granules is heparin, which prevents blood clotting. In this slide, you can see in the center is a basophil. And this one's a little bit larger than the red blood cell, but you'll see the granules are fairly dark. In the middle, you can see a little bit of a nucleus here, but it is again a little bit hard to see. Here's another slide containing a neutrophil and a basophil. Which one is the basophil? If you guessed this one, you would be correct. The other one you can see is a neutrophil, and this is evident from the many-lobed nuclei. The next two types of leukocytes are actually agranulocytes, and they don't contain granules. Lymphocytes are the second most common type of white blood cell you'll find. They have a dark purple, usually circular nucleus that often takes up the entire cell. Lymphocytes are usually found in lymphoid tissue, which we'll talk about later, instead of in the blood vessel. The purpose of lymphocytes is twofold. Well, it's onefold. It's mainly to defend the body, but there are two types of lymphocytes. T lymphocytes are T cells directly attack viruses and tumor cells and destroy them. B lymphocytes or B cells produce plasma cells, and these plasma cells produce antibodies, which are part of the immune response. In this picture, you can see in the center a lymphocyte. So you'll notice the round dark purple nuclei and a very thin surrounding layer of cytoplasm that doesn't have any granules in it. Can you guess what type of cell this is? If you guessed neutrophil, you guessed correctly. This is another picture of a lymphocyte, and you can see that the nucleus takes up a large part of the cell and only a very thin layer of the cytoplasm is visible. The last type of leukocyte is called a monocyte. Monocytes make up about 4 to 8% of all leukocytes, and they're the largest ones. This is fairly easy to see when you compare them to the surrounding red blood cells. They have a very pale blue cytoplasm, which of course has no granules, and their nuclei is U-shaped or kidney-shaped. Their purpose is that during infection they leave the blood vessel, they enter the infected tissue, and turn into a phagocyte. Now you might remember from biology that a phagocyte is a large cell that engulfs and destroys foreign material. So some people call it a cell eater. It also destroys dead debris, so it also removes debris. So that could be dead cells of the body. Another role of monocytes is to fight against extracellular and some intracellular bacteria. That means bacteria that exist mostly outside of the cell, and on some occasions inside. Here's a picture of a monocyte, and again you can see that there are no granules in the cytoplasm, and it has kind of a kidney bean shaped nuclei. Okay. Okay. No, let's Okay. Now what do I do?